forsaken mail-order bride, sat alone at the station, until a cowboy rode through the night to claim her. October 1880, Montana's loneliest depot, crouched beneath a gunmetal sky. Clara Hensley, 24, sat on a splintered bench, a crumpled letter heating one numb palm, a carpet bag ribboned to her wrist so no thief could run off with everything she owned. The wind ferreted through cracked boards, worrying the lantern until its light breathed in shallow, frightened pulses. 3 trains had come. 3 had gone. James Whitlock had not. Pride made her chin lift, though her teeth tapped a small, angry rhythm. A slate of clouds pressed low. Cinders clicked along the rails like counting beads. Somewhere far behind her, Illinois debts still hissed her name. She unfolded the page again. Blotted ink promised hearth, acreage, safety. Beneath the signature, a faint brown smear she had pretended was spilled coffee now looked like old blood. On the envelope flap, a second hand had penciled a crooked X, then rubbed it nearly smooth. The telegraph key on the desk wore a chip, as if struck in anger. The person who sent the last message had pressed too hard. Outside, the prairie held its breath. A tin sign squealed. Far off, hoofbeats threaded the storm, steady, closing. Clara's carpetbag rope tugged her skin. She did not untie it. A horse and rider rose from the sleet like a developing photograph. Hat brim low, coat hem snapping, saddle strings hissing with ice. He halted at the platform and raised a gloved hand to the light. No badge, no smile. A wedding band hung on a leather thong at his throat. Miss Hensley, his voice carried a calm that seemed practiced. You shouldn't be here alone. James Whitlock was to meet me, she said, and felt the lie inside the word was. The ring at his throat ticked, as if it knew her name. I know, the stranger said. I'm Elias Monroe, and I rode all night because James can't come for a reason I can't say here. What happened next will shock you. October wind worried the eaves of the Montana depot, while Clara Hensley held her shoulders square against the cold, and the ache that had followed her from Illinois. Before creditors came knocking, she had been a seamstress in Peoria, fingers quick over hems and cuffs, eyes steady while she measured farmers' wives and courthouse clerks, a young woman who believed neat stitches could hold a life together. Then the bank called in a note after her father's lumber venture collapsed, and a fever took her mother just when work might have paid down interest. Clara sold the sewing machine, packed 2 dresses, a shawl, a Bible with corners worn thin, and a small tin of needles because leaving craft behind felt like abandoning breath. She answered James Whitlock's advertisement after weeks of swallowing pride, copying his address in careful script, then waiting for letters that arrived smelling faintly of the depot sack. He wrote in a manner that seemed solid. Acres near a creek, a plain house, a mild-tempered team. Intentions honorable. He wanted companionship, help with meals, and a household that looked like decency. The promise sounded almost like salvation to a woman whose prospects had narrowed to a thread. Now the letter lay creased in her pocket, telling a story that might have been true. The depot where she now waited seemed less a building than a stubborn idea refusing to bow to the weather. Planks gaped. A narrow window leaked draught. A pot-belly stove ticked like an old heart that might quit without warning. Beyond the platform, prairie rolled to a dark ridge where pines massed like soldiers. A storm line had gathered there since dawn, shouldering more sky each hour. 3 days had settled over Clara like silt, each one thieving a little more color from her hope. First, she stepped onto the platform with the train's heat still in her coat, and looked for a signboard with her name or a man who matched the steady hand from those letters. Men disembarked with crates, rifles wrapped in oiled cloth, boxes of glassware that chimed together. A woman with a baby tucked under her shawl hurried past, face set toward a wagon where a man held out both arms. Evening came. No Jay. The station master, a compact fellow with a mustache like 2 gray wings, cleared his throat, asked if someone was due, and offered a bench near the stove until closing. She told him yes, spoke James's name softly, and saw pity touch the corners of the man's eye. That pity made her stand straighter. By the second day, the blanket cost her 2 dimes, and the station master produced a chipped enamel cup for coffee so weak it looked like sorrow. He said weather could stall a man in a drawer, said her gentleman might be cutting trail through gumbo, said a creek could rise and force a camp. Clara nodded because kindness deserved agreement, even when it made no dent. She washed in the freight room with water that smelled faintly of coal dust, plaited her hair, and mended a torn curtain with thread pulled from a cuff she could spare. If anyone asked, she said James's team must have cast a shoe or a bridge went out upriver. The man behind the window did not argue. Instead, he set a hard biscuit by the ledger, as if it had tumbled there by accident, and she was free to accept. The third morning painted the prairie a color like pewter. The schedule chalked on the board promised arrivals that slid past in a blur of cinders, faces behind fogged windows, porters shouting, boots stamping. James Whitlock did not appear. She studied the signature at the bottom of his last note, a firm line under his name as though he believed in conclusions. She tried to read certainty in the pen pressure, tenderness in the curl of the J, faithfulness in the cross. It was a foolish business, searching for ink for character, but desperation makes superstition look like reason. She considered telegraphing east and calculated the cost against her remaining coin. She thought of turning back and pictured the clerk in Peoria who had watched her sell the sewing machine, the way his eyebrows rose slightly when she counted out the last of her change for the trunk shipment. Going back would mean eyes on her spine and mouths she would never see forming tidy judgments. That afternoon the wind picked up from the west, shouldering grit along the ties, scouring breath and thought. The storm beyond the ridge stacked higher, the underside green the way summer skies warn of hail, though the calendar said October. Clara rehearsed the possibilities that felt least like humiliation. She could hire out to cook for a section crew until spring. She could stitch for a mercantile in a town whose name she did not yet know. She could turn back east with nothing but smoke in her hands. Each option felt like crossing thin ice. The station master began sweeping early, glancing toward the platform with a frequency that said he had seen other hopeful figures sink in this same place. When she stepped outside to clear her head, she smelled snow hidden inside the wind. It carried a metallic edge, almost like iron. She thought of Illinois winters, sleet on brick, grit under city horses' hooves, and the way her mother would set a kettle to sing against gloom. A whistle sounded far off, a train that would pass without stopping. Darkness came. The man behind the window trimmed the lantern and cleared his throat once more. "Miss," he said, choosing care, "you may bid by the stove if you need. I can fetch a spare blanket tonight." She thanked him, dignity stitched over fear, and said she would sit a while longer in case someone had been delayed by work and light would guide him the last miles. He nodded without disagreement. Late in the day, hoofbeats threaded the gale and brought a horse and rider across the cattle guard with a sound like thunder's rehearsal. The man swung down, tall, spare through the chest, coat hem flaring in the gust. Ice feathered the brim of his horse blew steam that drifted white, then vanished. The rider's glance cut the platform, passed over sacks of oats, a battered piano, headed upriver, a red kerosene tin, the station master's boots, and stopped at Clara. He removed one glove, not both, revealing a hand lined by work and cold. His voice when he spoke was even, the kind that stays measured in a wreck. "Evening, looking for Miss Hensley." Clara rose with care, as though any quickness might send what remained of her plans skittering. "I am Clara," she said, hearing the rawness under politeness. The station master moved around the counter, made introductions as though officiating in a courtroom. He placed the stranger's name in the air like a document. Elias Monroe. The syllables fit the landscape. He did not widen his stance or crowd space. He touched his hat brim, then let his hand fall. He introduced himself as Elias Monroe, spoke the name like a fact and nothing larger. He owned a modest spread out past a bend where cottonwoods rattled, a place with grass enough for a few head if the weather cooperated, soil enough for potatoes if one believed in that kind of labor, and a roof that shed water most of the time. He said the trail from there to the depot could be ridden between the worst gusts if one knew how the wind jumped canyons. He did not sit, did not lean, did not offer any remark that presumed intimacy. Instead, he said James had been meant to ride down from a line cabin 2 days prior, and had... Dawn broke pale over cottonwoods, as Clara rode beside Elias, toward his modest spread, fingers aching inside, borrowed mittens, skirt hem, tucked to keep mud from chewing the cloth. The trail left the rail line and entered rolling ground where sagebrush stirred and jackrabbits streaked like thrown stones. At a low rise he pointed toward a patched roof, smoke inching from a crooked pipe, corrals stitched from rails salvaged after floods. A field with straw rose rough under frost. He dismounted, loosened the cinch, led the gelding into a lean-to, then stepped aside so Clara could descend without touching his arm. She slid down stiffly, boots meeting earth that accepted weight without comment. Inside, plank walls chinked with mud, a scarred table, a narrow bed, a cold stew pot, shelves with flour, beans, coffee, a jar of fat, and one dented tin cup. A braided rope hung by the door with a bell for coyotes. Elias said she could take the bed until they arranged something honorable. He would sleep in the tack room, and meals would be her domain if she wished to earn keep. She nodded, set the carpet bag down, and unrolled the shawl like a banner of belonging. Work steadied hand. She filled the pot, scraped ash into the scuttle, stacked kindling, struck a match and coaxed flame. Onion, bacon rind, and potatoes went in, then salt. She wiped the table, swept with a broom that shed twigs, rinsed the cup until the tin lost its coal smell. While the stew simmered, she sorted shelves, mended a split towel with thread hidden in her bodice, and set aside a cotton sack to turn into a curtain. Elias brought a pail from the spring, and egg. He did not linger, only lifted the lid once, inhaled, and said the house had missed that fragrance for longer than he cared to admit. They ate with elbows in, traded short lines about fence, creek and weather. He paused, looked toward the door, and said grace without ceremony. After the dishes, he showed a shed with a harness, a small smithing setup, a grindstone, and a cedar chest holding a folded quilt. Use any pan, any needle, fix breaks with wire or sense, he said. Frontier rhythm arrived quickly. Morning meant fire, coffee, bread if flour allowed, then water hauled, hens checked, stalls raked, ashes carried, windows wiped with vinegar, shirts scrubbed on a board until skin went pink. Noon meant stew, cornbread if fat held out. Afternoon meant darning, patching, boiling sheets, scraping soot from the stove mouth, and counting beans to judge when a trip to town might wait. Evening meant lamplight, and a chapter from a novel. A drover traded for coffee. She learned the creek's moods, how wind slapped water flat, then ruffled it, how hawks wrote slow language across sky. She learned where the ground went soft, and stole hooves, where cottonwoods whispered louder than any sermon when the weather shifted. Shirts dried stiff if rinses came cold. Bread rose reluctantly when the room shivered. Frying fat popped like rifle fire if moisture got clever in the pan. Fingers toughened, shoulders found steadiness, and a quiet took root that came from tasks finished in order. Homesteading asked for invention, and paid with meals eaten warm and rooms that smelled like soap. Rather than worry, she marked days by useful metrics: seams closed, jars scrubbed, paces from door to gate without a stumble. Now and then she allowed memories of Illinois and refused to stay there long. Elias kept cadence with chores that required height and force. He repaired a fence span with a cottonwood post, dragged up a drawer, reset a shoe with nails saved in a tobacco tin, hauled hay from a stack under canvas, chopped billets, and replaced a hinge using washers cut from an old strap. He spoke sparingly, yet when speech arrived, it carried weight. No showy jokes, no pity that shrank another, no tools left where feet might find them. When snow hissed along the window and knots popped in the stove's heat, he stayed near the door while she moved around the room, a courtesy that looked like distance but felt like respect. On the third evening he brought in a coil of rope and laid it near the hearth to thaw, then stood with arms crossed while steam lifted. Clara set the bread to cool and leaned against the counter, aware that the room held two pasts, trying not to collide. She said carefully that honesty was due since they shared walls. James had written sweet lines, had promised acres, shelter, a place to belong, then failed to appear. She did not pick gentler words. She said betrayal and watched flame reflect in the kettle steel. Elias listened without flinching. He rested knuckles on the table and said a sister once took sick in spring, when froth lay on creek water. A doctor rode late. A cough tightened until breath could not find chest. He had held the door for neighbors who came with pies and pity, and left with silences that rang louder than any storm. After the burial, chores went on whether hearts kept pace or not. That loss built a wall inside him that he did not know how to lower without risking collapse. He said these lines slowly, measuring each admission. The room changed shape. Clara dried her hands on a towel and said, promises on paper had made her believe a good future could exist. Silence out here had made her doubt herself rather than the man who failed. She did not cry, yet her voice asked for recognition. He nodded once, then asked whether she wished to send a message east, or keep moving forward one practical mile at a time. She chose forward, because that decision held bread, warmth, tasks and a roof that might leak yet still sheltered bodies, and the following days pressed lessons into muscle and mind. She learned to cut biscuits with a tin dipped in flour, so edges rose clean, render tallow without scorching, wash a floor with sand when soap ran low, freshen air with pine tips boiled, save thread by basting long and tying small knots, mend gloves with a stitch that looked nearly new. She walked the fence with Elias after a gale scattered a stack, carried a hammer while he set staples, held a post while he tamped dirt, and felt useful in a way money had never purchased. Coyotes sang beyond the ridge. She pressed fingers against the sill and counted voices. One late afternoon, cloud bands dragged tattered light across snow, and the cabin went dim before the lamp gained flame. Clara stood by the stove, waiting for coffee to perk, and found her hand shaking despite steady breath. She told Elias about a final note from James that had arrived with a smudge she had called careless ink, though it looked harsher. She wondered whether lies can stain paper deeper than rain. Elias said he did not defend any man who left vows unkept, then added that prairie trials expose character, the way wind strips paint from clapboard. He spoke of days when cattle drifted and nights when loneliness made pipes tempters to men who had sworn off smoke. He acknowledged temptation without excusing harm. That balance steadied her. Morning after morning, she tested recipes against the high air, learned to move the kettle farther from flame so dough would rise, and learned to cover bowls with warmed cloth. Blisters hardened, then vanished. Steam from the wash water curled her bangs and left a mineral taste on her lips. She traded a mended shirt to a neighbor for a pouch of yeast, a neat seam on a saddle blanket for turnips. When ice rimmed the trough, she broke it with the back of an axe. A loose plank on the porch banged, until she wedged it silent. That night, while wind poured at the rafters, she told Elias that the worst part of the depot had not been cold or hunger, but the echo after the final train. He nodded and said a person has to answer the echo with duty, until voices return. She absorbed that as law. She began to set the table with care, even on lean days, shook crumbs into her palm, and kept the doorstone neat. Small order eased the ache, the way a salve soothes cracked skin. Elias wrapped a cut finger with a strip torn from his handkerchief, tied neatly. Trust did not arrive like thunder. It gathered like snow until the roof carried real weight and did not cave. Wind braided new sounds around the east. She watched dawn widen over the ridge, and felt a steadier breath answer it. Not triumph, not surrender, simply resolve shaped by habit and care, the kind that turns strangers into allies and empty rooms into shelter. If anyone listening knows the taste of broken trust yet kept moving anyway, leave a line about that strength when you can, so fellow travelers feel less alone. Frontier life had moved her from helpless waiting to useful action, and that shift, though modest, felt like a vow she could make to herself and keep for now. Night fell with a grinding wind that shaved the ridge bare. By dawn, the world had narrowed to a roar against log and nail. Clara woke to frost lace on the panes, and the stove ticking like a worried heart. Elias had gone at first light to check the north fence, leaving a note pinned with a horseshoe: keep fire strong, boil water, tie scarves, bell bow ready. She buttoned to the throat, wrapped a shawl under a borrowed coat, pulled on mittens that smelled of saddle soap, and stepped into air so cold it rang. In the corral, two heifers pressed a gate till the latch squealed. Clara moved with calm, learned from tasks that punished haste. She spoke to the cattle as if to frightened children, swung the panel, and eased them toward the willow hurdles. Elias had set in autumn. She hauled buckets, poured hot water into the trough, and watched steam lift like spirits. She hung a line between the door and the stall, and counted steps until the porch rose again under her boots. Elias did not return. She strapped a scarf across her mouth and nose, shoved a hat low, and followed the fence with one hand, while the other hid a lantern inside her coat. At the north pasture, a drift piled against rails, and beyond it a dark knot of cattle wedged in the angle. Snow sealed their noses, eyes rolled white, bodies leaned like one tied against timber, ready to snap. Clara clawed a gap with a shovel, climbed the fence, dropped into the pocket, and pressed warm hides until the led cow found the cut she opened. A steer stumbled. She jammed her shoulder under its neck, braced, and heaved until it lurched, then followed her as if she were current. One by one the others came. She swung the gate toward a wash, where cottonwoods broke the blast and rattled the chain till it bit. Back at the yard she found Elias's hat pinned to the rail by a knife, the blade pointing west toward the bluff that cupped the creek. She took rope, canvas, axe and a pouch of oats, and set off into white that erased angles. At the bluff she saw tracks scoured nearly clean, and a dark slit where cattle had drifted into a coulee seeking lee side. She slid down and found Elias hip-deep, coaxing a heifer off a ledge, breath ragged, beard rimed. He glanced up, relief crossing his eyes, and passed her the rope without wasting syllables. They worked as if training had stitched them together. She looped horns, set feet, leaned while he eased from behind. When panic rose, she murmured until tremor softened. When ice cut skin, he knotted a strip and moved on. Twice the wind knocked her sideways. Twice his palm steadied her without turning care into clay. By late afternoon, 3 calves lay under canvas, bellies against warm stones she had carried from the hearth, while cows milled above, boxed by willows and drift. Elias shouted that the creek was icing in slabs. Weaker stock would founder if it seethed. They pushed the herd along the rim toward a basin cupped by spruce. Cattle bawled, snow smoked from backs, hooves crushed crust with a sound like crockery breaking. At the saddleback the wind flung a sheet that erased everything but the rope between them. Clara wrapped it twice around her waist and felt the pull of moving weight like a harsh blessing. She lowered her head, counted to 20, checked bearing, counted again, a rhythm that beat panic flat. When the string cleared the last rise, the storm slackened enough to show the dooryard and a square of lamplight behind oiled paper. They bunched cattle near stacked hay and threw open the side shed. The first animals surged inside and steamed the dark until rafters dripped. Elias slammed the bolt and leaned, then straightened with a small, fierce nod. She split kindling, fed the stove, salted water, crumbled oats, filled buckets, and carried them in a figure 8 that kept her feet under her. A calf nosed her skirt. She lifted its head and felt life in the warm, insistent push. Wind still tore at corners but had lost its teeth. Inside she poured coffee and found Elias at the doorway, eyes rimmed red from blown snow. He said low that he had not expected such grit from someone who arrived by rail with a light trunk. Night deepened. A cow had calved too early and lay trembling in the far stall. Clara tucked the newborn under canvas with one stone, rubbed the mother's flank until shudders unwound, and spoke of Illinois mornings when sleet made bricks squeal, and her mother would pour broth and say, "Drink, then try." The cow rose, swayed, then steadied. When the door fell and bolted, the house felt like a ship on a hard sea. Clara carried an extra blanket toward the tack room and paused at the plank wall. Elias spoke to the dark as men do when measuring themselves. His words came flat and practical. The ranch might hold if weather played fair. A hired hand would stay through spring. A gentle woman from far away might not when Thor showed how empty miles stretched. That judgment struck like sleep. Clara set the wool on a peg, returned to the stove, banked coals, trimmed the lamp, and carried silence like a pail that must not spill. At dawn the gale broke. Snow had planed the yard smooth, except where hooves wrote proof that effort mattered. Elias stopped short when he saw coffee ready, bread rising, floors swept, boots dried, and a neat stack of kindling. He began to say he had spoken out of caution, learned the hard way. Clara lifted a hand and said the explanation could wait if actions followed sense. She asked whether the fence west of the lime cabin still stood. He said probably not. She wrapped her scarf, took a hammer and staples, and said she could hold posts while he tamped. They walked under a sky scrubbed raw and glittering. At the break they set braces, hauled rails and worked until collars soaked, despite air that stung. By midday the herd grazed in scoured patches, calves dozed, and the waterhole wore a thin lid that broke with a boot heel. Clara tested the gate, tugged twice, and felt the ache in her shoulders that meant work had written its mark. Elias cleared his throat and said something plain. Whatever rumor had carried James's name as promise, had torn trust, yet her courage had stitched new cloth. Staying or leaving would be her choice, not a kindness granted by any man. They returned to chores that would continue whether hearts matched pace or needed time. Anyone listening who has stood inside weather or grief, debt, doubt, and still lifted weight until breath settled, consider leaving a short line about that day. Say how you found strength when pressure tried to crush it, so travelers across this wide country of worry, no steady hands exist beyond their own. The storm had stripped the ranch to its bone. Clara looked across rails, snow and sky, and thought she might belong if belonging meant doing what must be done when wind howls, animals need shelter, and morning asks for courage, more than words on paper. We endured together. Evening settled like a wool blanket after a day of repairs, and the house held a hush that sounded earned, not empty. Clara brewed coffee in the dented pot, lifted it off the flame before bitterness set in, and poured 2 cups while the stove's mica window pulsed amber. The storm had passed, the herd had steadied, ice cracked obediently under the axe, and the fence line west of the draw now braced against gusts that had bullied it since autumn. Work had used up most talk, leaving a quiet that invited truth. Clara sat with her back straight, not stiff, palms wrapped around heat that chased ache from fingers that had scrubbed, stitched, hauled, and carried without complaint. Elias cleared his throat, not to command attention but to steady it, and said the ranch felt different since the blizzard, not larger or richer, only honest, as if each board and rail had declared allegiance. Clara set her cup down so the saucer would not tremble. She said honesty had kept her standing at the depot when silence begged her to fold. She said the false promises inside James's letters had stained her pride, yet work here had rinsed much of that away. She did not rush the lines. She let truth occupy the room like lamplight, patient and bright. Elias drew the chair forward and finally sat. He looked at the scarred tabletop where knife scores crisscrossed like a rough map, and traced one line with a fingertip. He said he had learned the rhythm of caution so thoroughly that even gratitude sounded like risk when voiced aloud. He did not know what would be right to ask or promise, and he refused to pretend certainty in a land that punished claims. Yet after the night they had just walked through, he could not ignore the way her steadiness felt like a post driven to bedrock. Clara listened without interrupting because that was how she hoped to be heard. She said she had come west because a decent life still seemed possible, even after pride fell and money fled. Here she had found duties that returned dignity, and a neighbor's simple trade had turned her seams into bread. She would not leap toward any man to escape old shame. She preferred hunger to another lie. The stove sighed and threw a soft flare across his jaw. He met her gaze and did not look away. He said a house can hold 2 people who labor cleanly and speak plain, and that such a house can withstand seasons that break flashier arrangements. He proposed something that might sound cold, though it did not feel that way to him. A marriage of convenience, legal and public, made to ensure her safety and the ranch's continuity, with room for respect to grow at a pace neither forced. He offered his name at the courthouse in town, a share in decisions, the use of land, the right to leave if he ever treated her with less regard than he showed the stock under his care. He could build a separate room before Thor, if timber could be hauled, would buy cloth for a proper dress when the trail opened, and would ask the parson to bless what they shaped. If later affection rose, they would honor it. If not, they would keep kindness unbroken. Clara kept breathing, steady, counting heartbeats to avoid being carried by relief too quickly. She asked whether he wanted this because pity pressed him, or because he had weighed what they had managed together and found partnership practical. Elias said pity weakens the hand that offers it, and insults the hand that receives it. What he felt when she walked the fence with him, when she faced down a drift twice her height, when she rubbed life into a calf and coaxed a cow to stand, was not softness but respect and a fierce hope that steadiness like hers might anchor a future that would otherwise drift to waste. He said loneliness can drive men to foolish bargains. He preferred a vow that honored work and gave both the right to speak hard truths. Clara thought about Illinois, about the depot bench, about how the station master's quiet mercy had kept her from breaking, and about the way Elias had offered shelter without claiming ownership. She thought about the knife that pinned his hat to the rail, a sign for anyone searching that direction that matters here. She considered the practical weight of a winter that still had weeks to run, the long ride to town, the talk that would buzz in the mercantile after papers were signed, the way a ring could sit on a hand like promise or chain. She said she could accept if conditions were spoken in the open. She would manage the house without being treated as hired help. He would keep accounts transparent. Disputes would be settled at the table, not through silence. Prayer or scripture would be welcome when needed, but never used as a yoke. Elias agreed without flinch. He added that her sewing work would be hers to trade, and any earnings from that craft would remain under her control. He would place her name on the deed as soon as the law allowed, and until then would write a notarized statement that protected her claim if harm came to him during roundup or flood. He did not promise ease. He promised effort that would not quit. The clock on the mantel, a stubborn thing that needed coaxing after every change in weather, ticked into a silence that had become companionable rather than tight. Clara lifted her cup, swallowed, and found steadiness rather than tremor. She said yes. Elias nodded once and stood as if accepting charge of a task worth sweat. He said the parson would be in town on Friday if the road to the ford stayed passable, that the courthouse would witness vows even if choir and frills stayed dreams, for a warmer month, that a paper with neat lines could protect two people who had decided to face seasons together. After the words sat between them like a beam set true, he smiled in a way that softened the guarded angles she had first met at the depot. He fetched the cedar chest and set it on the table, opened the lid and took out a folded quilt stitched by hands that were gone. He said it had been meant for a cradle that never came. Perhaps now it could warm a future that had in its own unlikely way arrived. Clara brushed the tiny stars worked into the border, felt the neat seams under her thumb, and knew that grief, when honored, can turn into protection rather than a chain. They planned simply bread for witnesses, a sled path cut to the lane, a let-out dress with a clean collar, and a small box for papers. Later, with chores finished and the lamp trimmed low, they sat again, closer by a small measure that felt enormous. Clara told him about her mother's quiet strength, how laughter had lived in their kitchen even when cupboards thinned, how a line of stitches can redeem worn cloth, and how mercy can redeem a person. Elias spoke about his sisters singing and the way absence had taught him not to waste hours that could be shared. He said he did not know if love would blossom tidy like a garden row or wild like prairie lupine, but he would give it soil, water, and light, and would not trample new growth with fear. Clara's reply was simple. She would work beside him and guard the peace of their room. If anyone hearing this has taken a hard step not because certainty was offered, but because duty and hope made a bridge, consider leaving a short line about that leap, so others find courage for their own cross. The stove clicked, sparks drifted, and the night outside, once a threat, became a vast sheltering dark, where two resolute hearts could lay down their doubts and rest before morning, invited them to build the life they had chosen. Snowmelt still rimmed wagon ruts when Clara and Elias rode the sled to town, breaths blooming pale under cottonwoods that whispered like discreet witnesses. The parson waited in a courthouse room smelling of paper, leather, and coal. Two ranch wives served as witnesses, flour dust brightening their sleeves. Elias wore a brushed jacket and a clean shirt. Clara had basted a muslin dress, pinned her hair without fuss, and stitched a narrow collar from a scrap saved since Illinois. Vows crossed the small space between their voices and the clerk's ledger. plain words chosen for strength rather than shine. Elias's hand, coleused and steady, trembled once when the ring slid into place. Clara's gaze met his, and did not flinch. Snow sifted the steps when they left with a paper folded neatly and a silence that felt full, not empty. At home, routine resumed. He hauled rails. She rendered tallow. He mended tack. She cut curtains. They read aloud by lamplight until sleep trespassed. Respect ripened into tenderness through small acts. He saved the last slice of bacon for her. She left his hat dry on a peg when storms bullied the roof. One clear Sunday they rode the ridge and watched light comb the basin. Elias touched Clara's glove with caution, born of gratitude rather than fear, and said the night she braced a steer had revised his idea of courage. She answered that his promise of fairness before warmth had rewritten her idea of safety. They claimed no destiny, only a daily choice carried forward by shared work and clean speech. Summer crawled over hill. Neighbors brought cuttings. Bees buzzed the yard. A peddler traded seed for mended shirts, and Clara's seams purchased a small mirror and a comb carved with a flower. Thunderheads built like fortresses. Rain stampeded across sage. Laughter returned when wind stole Elias's hat, and she chased it with a whoop that startled magpies from the cottonwoods. By autumn, jars lined a shelf that caught afternoon gold. Calves were weaned, fences stood square, and Clara felt a flutter under her ribs before aspens finished their turn. She told Elias near the hearth while rain stitched lines along the roof. He went still, then knelt and rested his cheek against the curve of her waist, as if listening for a drum in deep timber. Gratitude warmed the room until even the stove seemed to hum. They prepared with thrift and joy, a cradle planed smooth, diapers hemmed neat, swaddles folded in a cedar chest, and a lullaby learned between chores. Winter returned hard. Snow vaulted fences. Wind found every gap. Troughs glazed overnight. Clara moved carefully yet refused idleness. Elias hauled extra wood under an awning improved in September and watched the sky with a tracker's eyes. Labor began during sleep. Clara breathed through pain the way her mother had taught during fierce Illinois winters, counted seconds against the kettle's hiss, and pressed forehead to the cool door jamb when a wave peaked. Elias kept the room steady, water hot, blankets warming, lamp trimmed, words few and useful. Just before dawn, the boy arrived, loud, indignant, perfect. They named him Caleb after a river guide Elias had admired for courage without swagger. Morning light broke across the ridge while Elias wrapped the child in the quilt once meant for a cradle that never came, and Clara laughed through tears that washed sorrow clean. Days blurred into a tender mark. Love no longer needed proof. It lived in bread sliced thin for a nursing mother, in boots dried by the stove, in a hand finding another under the quilt when wolves sang beyond the ridge. Trouble rode in with a thaw that turned the lane greasy and swelled the creek past its usual border. Wolves stayed scarce, so Elias ranged far to check a line cabin. By afternoon, a tight sky shoved another squall over the ridge. Clara barred the door, added wood, latched shutters, and listened. Hoofbeats approached with a cadence she did not know. Two riders slid from gray, bandanas hiding jaws, shotguns held with lazy confidence. Clara opened to a slit, saw eyes that counted her shelves, and weighed choices fast. She poured coffee, set tin cups down, and spoke calmly. Her husband would return any minute. They should move on before the trail iced. The tall man shrugged, lifted a jar into a sack, and grinned. His partner nudged toward the cradle with a curiosity that felt like a knife. Clara stepped between the intruder and her child. The tall one reached for the money box on the mantel. She said, "Take the coins and go." He laughed, hooked a finger under the box latch, and never saw the stove poker until iron met bone. He dropped, roaring. The other sprang, boot tangled in a loop of lariat she had kicked under his heel. He fell hard. She jerked the rope, pinned him, and yelled for him to stay down. Outside, hooves hammered. Elias burst through the door with snow in his beard and a rifle cradled low. He took in the scene, a groaning thief, a trussed partner, a wife steady as a fence post, and lowered the barrel just enough to keep judgment ready. Clara dragged the fallen man's shotgun across the floor with her heel and set it out of reach. Elias disarmed both, bound wrists with harness straps, and checked on Caleb before saying a single word. Only then did he look at Clara's scraped knuckles, eyes fierce with admiration and fear he refused to feed. Wind battered the cabin while they worked in practice tandem. She stoked the fire, calmed the baby, and brewed more coffee, because heat steadies nerves. He watched the windows, questioned the men with blunt patience, and waited out the squall. Dawn revealed tracks smearing away toward the draw. No accomplices in sight. They hauled the prisoners to town by sled. Neighbors stared. The sheriff wrote statements and advised caution through late winter. Back at the ranch, clouds wore a bruised edge, yet the valley felt changed. Danger had come and found a house too strongly joined to break. That night, with Caleb asleep between them and the stove, murmuring, Elias said he loved his wife not through convenience now, not only through gratitude, but through a devotion shaped by labor, tested by storm, proven under a gun's black mouth. Clara answered yes, then added that love must keep making meals, mending posts, lifting water, and telling the truth even when fear argues for silence. Spring softened the rib. Caleb's laugh landed like bright coins on every surface. Bees returned. Green threaded the earth, where snow had chewed all color. Elias built a tiny rocker and sanded it smooth, while Clara set herb seedlings along the porch. When rain rattled the roof, they moved close and read aloud. On a day stitched with sun and shadow, they rode to the ridge again, this time with Caleb bundled near Clara's heart. Clouds marched like proud banners, and far off a river flashed. Elias spoke softly about seasons and vows, about weather and work, about grace that can be built rather than found. Clara looked across the basin, where storms had once threatened everything, and felt awe rather than dread. She took his hand. Their marriage, born from duty, had ripened into love capable of standing in any sky. If you have ever taken a leap without guarantees, signed a line, walked into wind, defended what mattered, because right demanded it, consider leaving a short note for fellow travelers who might need that witness during their own dark weather. Montana kept muttering along the ridges, yet their home no longer felt exposed. Spring steadied the ridges, and the ranch adopted a rhythm shaped by work rather than worry. Clara moved through mornings with a confidence earned by storms outlasted and vows kept. Caleb clapped at the kettle while Elias planed boards for a sturdier door at the line cabin, shavings curling like pale ribbons on the floor. Neighbors began stopping by for talk, as often as for tools, leaving with lighter faces because the room itself seemed to teach calm. The place grew inch by inch, a square new gate on the lower pasture, a sound roof over the lean-to, a pen where hens scratched tidy loops and announced small victories. Clara planted herbs, set beans to climb, and taught Caleb to pat the soil twice as if blessing it. Elias hung a bell where meals, help, or glad news could be called with the same rope, and its note carried to the creek like a promise kept. On Sundays a circle formed, 2 ranch wives, a widower from upriver, a boy with a mandolin, a miner between jobs. Coffee went round, bread vanished, stories widened, and people left standing taller. One hot afternoon, a wagon labored up from the river. A lean man, Owen Pike, tipped a crushed hat. Beside sacks sat a girl with steady eyes and a tin box hugged to her ribs. Fever had taken her parents. Kin in Helena had closed their door. He hunted work and a place for the child. Could she stay a fortnight? The girl said her name, Mary, and added she could sweep and keep quiet. Clara recognized courage wearing courtesy and brought her inside before the question finished. Mary washed, ate without waste, and fed Caleb with such care that he laughed like creek water. Elias tightened the wagon runner while Owen spoke of bad ground and debt. A plan formed, letters through the depot, wages forwarded when earned. Mary sheltered here until harvest. The tin box, holding ribbon and deed stub, took a place on the mantel where respect could see it. The fortnight lengthened. Mary woke early, braided her hair, and asked for tasks. Clara taught beans, bread, and small stitches, Elias taught eggs, ears, and the gentle mare. Caleb toddled after her, wooden cow in fist. At night, when quiet grew heavy, Clara asked soft questions about the road and the good memories worth saving, then let silence do its gentler work. Autumn multiplied duties. Elias stretched wire on the south line and shored a washout with stone. Clara kept the ledger, traded eggs for seed and cloth for sugar, and listed households that would need help when snow came. The porch became a small hall, a Bible lesson, a tune, pies, children weaving between boots. The bell rang often, sometimes for supper, sometimes for aid. Word drifted downriver that this was a house where a rider could find food and fairness. Letters from Owen arrived with money orders and tired lines. Camps moved, wages lagged, risks stayed high. Another month, then another. Mary worked without complaint, yet sometimes stared at the mantel as if reading a future there. Clara taught her to weave rush mats by the cottonwoods, to make patterns when her mind wanted to rattle apart. They beat rugs, polished the stove until Micah winked, and lined jars for apples to be simmered with cinnamon. In town, the storekeeper hired Clara to sew 3 dresses. Payment came as calico and peppermint. The work no longer smelled like fear. It smelled like soap and hope. Near harvest's end, a letter brought wages and finality. A slide had taken Owen. The foreman had spoken a prayer and sent what he could. The page trembled in Clara's hand, until Elias set his palm on Mary's shoulder and held steady while grief did its work. The bell rang once for morning. Mary asked where she belonged. Clara answered, "Here." Elias filed for guardianship, sent notices to distant kin, and returned with papers that matched the promise already living in the house. The parson blessed the choice. The clerk shook hands and said the county needed families to run on decency. Winter tested the roof and patience. Mary shared mornings, filled lamps, taught Caleb to stack blocks, and learned a hymn on a fiddle. A neighbor surrendered at last. Clara stitched a school dress, added a ribbon from the tin box, and wrote Mary's full name in the collar so the world could not misplace it again. Elias built a small desk from offcuts. Lessons began by lamplight, sums, penmanship, and maps that placed mountains where rumor had left blanks. Confidence grew like a seedling under glass. Community ties tightened with every rescue after a blow, every wagon hauled from Gumbo, each loaf set on a porch where sickness lingered. Clara organized a quilting day that filled the house with needles flashing like minnows and pies cooling on the rail. A comforter traveled upriver before dusk for a woman near confinement. Men who once tipped hats out of habit now asked her judgment on seed, storage, and which family should receive an extra cord. Respect settled because service had preceded. In spring, parents gathered under cottonwoods to talk about a school. Elias argued for a stout roof and plank floor. Clara argued for a shelf where borrowed books could rest without shame. Mary volunteered to clean the room, carry notices to far homesteads, and help younger children hold chalk steady. Coins, beans, a ham, and a bolt of rough cloth built the fund. By midsummer, a one-room school stood near the bell post, white paint catching morning light. On opening day, the bell called children who had once avoided each other. They sat on benches, smoothed by planing, eyes bright, slates ready. Clara watched Mary guide Caleb to a front seat, hand firm on his shoulder, and felt gratitude settle where fear used to live. The ranch kept growing in the quiet way healthy things do. Twins lived. The creek ran clear because stones set last summer held the bank, and calves fattened in a pasture that finally looked generous. Travelers found not just food but order, a floor swept, a chair ready, a word that fit the time. When thunder marched along the ridge, Clara called the children in with a tone that sounded like safety. One evening, a neighbor boy arrived wild-eyed to say his father lay pinned under a wagon. Elias grabbed the bar, rope, and jack. Clara packed a basket and rode with them. In mud and failing light, she braced the lamp, talked the trapped man past panic, and set shoulders under a wheel when timing required 3 bodies, and only 2 were ready. The lift held. The man breathed. His wife cried into Clara's shawl. By morning, word had spread. People stopped mentioning that she had once been abandoned at a depot. They called her the woman who showed up where weight needed lifting. Through it all, love did not grandstand. It lived in durable gesture. Elias saved the last slice, sharpened knives and built shelves at the school after long days. Clara warmed his boots, kept books square, and met his gaze in a way that made sentences unnecessary. Mary, no longer a guest, moved like a daughter, quick to work, quick to laugh, slow to judge. Caleb's chatter braided through the house like birdsong. Sometimes Clara remembered the chipped enamel cup and the timetable that lied. Then she looked at the bell that had rung for morning and meals, at Mary writing neatly under lamplight, at Caleb asleep with a wooden cow in his fist, at Elias sanding a cradle rail for some neighbor's child, and she understood the arc. She had traveled from forsaken to foundation. Authority did not come from volume or ease. It came from foresight, fairness, and a welcome that did not pinch. Storms still prowled the ridges, but the house answered with warmth. Rails stayed true, cattle grazed heavily, seeds sprouted, and a school bell joined their bell in measuring days. Neighbors lingered after meetings because peace felt rare on frontiers. If anyone asked how steadiness formed, Clara would gesture to the ledger, the stove, the bell, the porch, and the people gathered there, and say love married to work builds a country under one roof. By the time autumn returned, the ranch no longer looked like it had merely survived. It looked ready to shelter others. Mary stood taller than the girl who had clutched a tin box. Caleb ran straighter, laughing when leaves chased him down the path. Elias glanced toward Clara and touched his hat brim in the old way that meant respect rather than habit. She answered with a look that carried history and decision. The valley, stormy as ever, felt like home because she had made it so, and the woman who once sat alone at a depot now stood at her own door, steady as a bell post, calling weary travelers toward life. The letter arrived on a hot wind that rattled the cottonwoods, cream paper sealed with wax, and a clerk's careful hand declaring matters of probate. Elias read first, jaw tightening while he measured every line, then passed the page to Clara, who sat on the porch with Caleb asleep against her hip and Mary tracing letters beside the rocker. It reported that James Whitlock had died the previous winter in a mining camp 2 territories south. His effects included a parcel near the river east of town, a stack of scrip, and a mule. And because his advertisement and correspondence with Clara had produced a journey and a public intention, noted by the station master, the court awarded her a deed to that parcel together with damages, modest in sum yet honest. Silence followed, not shocked, simply weighty. Clara folded the page, felt memories lift like ash, and said the land should be used for something that turned sorrow into shelter. Elias nodded, relief and caution braided in his eye. Neighbors wandered up as news spread. The bell carried a clear tone that usually meant supper, yet now sounded like a new chapter. By evening the porch filled with hats, cups, kind hands, and a clatter of ideas. Someone suggested renting the parcel to a sawyer. Another proposed selling and buying cattle. Clara listened, thanked each voice, and said she wanted children who had been drifting to have a place where numbers, letters, and practical arts could anchor them hard against weather, hunger, and the lonely kind of silence. A larger school, she said, with a library, a small kitchen, a bell that could call hope as well as lessons, and a board that answered to the valley, not to pride. Mary's chin lifted. Caleb thumped the porch rail. Elias said a school that taught hands as well as minds would give the country a future that did not blow away in the first storm. They walked the river parcel at dawn, dew lighting the grass in cold sparks, cottonwoods lifting green spires along a bend that smelled of silt, mint, and promise. The ground sat above flood marks, close to a wagon trace, open enough for a yard and a guard. Elias drove stakes while Clara paced the perimeter with a ledger, noting sunlight angles, wind, and where children would warm fingers when northerlies cut through autumn. A lawyer in town filed the deed, transfer, and set aside the scrip in a fund labeled for books, repairs, and wages. The mule, lean and contrary, pulled stones until even stubbornness found respect. Work is multiplied in honest way. Clara organized quilting circles that produced coverlets to raffle. Elias bartered posts for a load of milled planks. Mary wrote letters to miners, drovers, and storekeepers asking for cast-off atlases, readers, arithmetic guides, and any volumes whose spines still held. Donations arrived, wrapped in burlap, Shakespeare missing a title page, a botany manual annotated by a woman doctor passing through, hymnals with fractured bindings, journals stitched from brown paper. Clara sorted and mended, labeling each with neat script, building a library where weary minds could sit down and drink. Framers raised walls while children hauled nails in pockets and sang off-key. A neighbor set the bell on a timber tower. Another carved an open hand over the door. Elias laid floorboards tightly, refused gaps that would catch small feet, and shaped wide sills for plants. Clara fought for windows, a second stove, and pegs for coats. The roof went on straight, creaking once as if learning its own name, then settling like a promise. On dedication day, the valley walked in wearing Sunday best or work clothes, scrubbed honestly. The parson spoke briefly, the clerk read the grant, a fiddler set a tune, and Mary, now taller and sure, rang the bell until swallows looped it. Children flowed inside to touch maps, slate and shelves that gleamed. Caleb found a stool, opened McGuffey, and sounded out words with a seriousness that made the room hush. Clara stood at the threshold, not as a beggar at a station but as a steward greeting travelers. She remembered the chipped cup, the timetable's lies, and the night wind that had tried to fold her life small, then looked at faces bright with expectation, and felt the stretch of gratitude in muscle and bone. The ranch kept pace with the school. Elias fenced a new pasture and dug a ditch that led creek water through a gated run to a field where potatoes would carry neighbors through lean years. Caleb grew sturdy, his laugh ringing like the bell when chores ended. Mary helped teach little ones letters in the morning, then stitched aprons, copied inventory, and some afternoons read aloud from borrowed volumes while bread perfumed the corridor. Clara managed accounts with a fairness that everyone trusted. Receipts matched goods. Every coin left a paper trail that even the most suspicious rancher could follow with a finger. A dry summer tried the valley, but the ditch kept greens alive, and the bell tower cast a square patch of shade where elders sat telling true things. When a widow 3 miles upriver collapsed during harvest, the school kitchen sent broth, loaves, and a rotation of hands. When a sheep wagon burned on the flats, the library replaced 2 boys-only books. When a storm split the school chimney, Elias and 3 neighbors braced ladders while Clara held the line that kept tools from falling and children from crowding trouble. The building learned to take harm and stand straighter. New challenges found them ready. One afternoon, a stranger arrived with a letter naming Clara the beneficiary of a small insurance policy James had purchased during the fevered optimism of early prospecting. The sum would not make anyone grand, yet it could end uncertainty for a decade if handled without vanity. Clara and Elias sat at the table and decided together. They bought pasture bordering the school so play could spill into safety, paid a modest wage to a widowed teacher with a spine like a plumb line, and built a shed where tools and instruments would sleep dry. They created a scholarship fund in 3 envelopes, one for books, one for boots, and one for a train ticket if a promising pupil earned a place at a distant academy and wanted to return with skills no one here had yet learned. Rumor called it ambition. Clara called it sowing the valley with future shade. With growth came friction. A merchant argued that taxes should pay for improvements, not private funds. A rancher sneered that girls needed churns, not slates. Clara answered without heat. Public money would follow once trust widened. Meanwhile, children should not wait for politics to catch up. As for girls, she said, a household thrives when minds are fed, and the valley thrives when mothers can read invoices, tally weights, and draft petitions. Mary, standing behind her, raised her chin and smiled at the floor to keep victory from looking like a gloat. Autumn gilded cottonwoods, geese stitched letters across the sky, harvest wagons creaked toward town. Share a moment you found purpose in helping others, so courage travels further today. Morning light spilled over cottonwoods and settled on a porch once a rough plank, now the front step of a small country home. Clara carried Grace against her shoulder, the baby's breath warm on her neck, while Caleb tugged at a line he claimed could catch sunlight, and Mary read to neighbor children who had come early for lessons. Elias checked the gate, glanced at a blue sky, then came up the path with that respectful tilt of the hat that had first told her he would never use strength to prove anything except care. Fences stood true, the bell waited for its ring, and the creek murmured through willows like a steady hymn. Years earlier, despair had sat beside a timetable and a chipped cup, Now Hope lived in a balanced ledger, shelves of readers, and a cradle carved by patient hands. Clara kissed Grace's temple and watched Mary trace a route westward on a pale map, while Caleb asked if stars above the ridge could be counted faster than calves. And Elias said both tasks required patience and shoes tied tight. They laughed, then turned toward tradition. Animals fed before dawn, papers laid out on desks, bread set to rise, tools returned to pegs. Neighbors drifted in with news and requests, leaving with stew or advice. The bell rang. Children crossed the yard, cheeks pink, boots knocking in rhythm. Mary guided them through letters, numbers, and the small civility that keeps crowded rooms from turning sharp. Clara, holding Grace, walked the aisles, offering encouragement where courage sagged, praising effort with the seriousness she gave a good harvest, while Elias repaired a hinge, fit a latch, cut kindling, and slipped outside to mend wire before the weather could think about mischief. Life had not become grand, it had become generous. Supper happened because hands learned to share weight. Study happened because minds learned to sit still. Peace happened because a household refused to let fear run conversation. At night, when the wind moved through cottonwoods and coyotes told their old story, the house glowed like a lantern cupped against darkness. Clara sang a lullaby her mother once hummed over wash water. Elias read from a borrowed classic. Mary finished a dress for a neighbor while whispering tomorrow's lesson. Caleb asked for another chapter about explorers who crossed mountains with stubborn hope and practical boots. Between those rituals lay a marriage that began as a contract and ripened into devotion, strong enough to hold against weather, rumor, and sudden dangers. She remembered outlaws at the door, and a blizzard's white roar. Those trials steadied rather than stunned. Every board carried endurance, a scrape where a cradle bumped during a hurried rescue, a stain where broth saved a man with fever, a notch on the bell frame marking the day a girl with a tin box became a daughter with a desk and a lamp. Grace's fingers flexed, then settled. Elias touched Clara's wrist with quiet pride that felt like shelter, not claim. Later, a note from the clerk confirmed the scholarship fund would send a bright student east next spring. Ticket purchased, books ordered, and board arranged. Relief rose because commitment had taken shape and would carry one more story farther than this valley. At noon, riders and walkers arrived from ranches spread across miles of sky, setting down pies, beans, and jars of preserve. A tune rose, the bell offered a welcome ring, and chairs scraped while people talked irrigation, winter stores, and a letter from a legislator who had noticed a school grown from private resolve into public good. Clara spoke plainly: steady wages for teachers, coal for cold months, shingles after storms, and the promise that no child would leave hungry or ignored. Elias followed with details that made listeners nod. Mary read a passage. Caleb displayed proud arithmetic and a drawing of the tower with lines straighter than last week's attempt. After the meeting, chores resumed, laughter thinned to murmurs, and travelers drifted home beneath a sky building a gray roof. Clara stood in the doorway holding Grace and allowed herself one look at the world they had shaped from scraps, work, and mercy. She had arrived a forsaken bride, unsure of another hour's kindness. She stood now a matriarch able to pass on strength without hoarding it. The path from bench to bellpost had been made of choices so ordinary they hid their own glory. Show up, tell truth, keep account, feed neighbors, refuse cruelty, invite help, forgive when repentance came real. Love had learned to move as quietly as bread rising. Clouds lowered and wind fretted, reminding them that ease never lasts long. Elias rode to the south pasture with 2 men to bring in strays. Mary stacked wood. Caleb tucked Grace's blanket and promised a story about a mighty river. Clara set a stew, checked windows, and listened for hoofbeats. When Elias returned after dusk, wet and cold, he set his hat on the peg and looked across the room with gratitude that had once been wary and now was sure. He took Grace, kissed Caleb's hair, thanked Mary for keeping the fire eager, then met Clara's gaze with a softness that still felt new even after years of partnership. They ate, cleaned, read, and let the night have its weather while the house kept its steadiness. Later, when children slept and lamps burned low, they spoke about the road behind and the one ahead. She said she had feared abandonment would brand her days. He said he had feared grief would weld his heart shut. Together they had proved both predictions wrong by choosing service over fear, allegiance over pride, and daily kindness over noise. Grace sighed in her cradle. The stove clicked. Wind relented. Morning would bring more of the same: animals to tend, papers to file, neighbors to support, triumphs to acknowledge, and humble gestures that knit communities against storm. Clara reached across the table, laced fingers with the man who rode through a night to claim duty and found love waiting at the end of it, and felt gratitude land with a calm weight. Her life had not become a story about rescue, it had become a story about building, and she wanted others to be invited into that work. Before bed she penned a notice and added a line beneath the schedule. Tell us where you listen from. Are you reading on a ranch, in a city room beside a river, or under a sky that smells like rain? Share your town and country below so our campfire includes your place. If this journey gave you strength, pass it to a friend. If it sparked courage, subscribe for more tales that trade despair for stubborn hope and show how ordinary hands raise extraordinary roots. Bring your story to the comments, ring the bell so new chapters find you, and help us keep this valley bright. Clara trimmed the lamp, kissed Grace, and whispered a blessing she would keep speaking as long as breath allowed. The porch held evening cool, the bell waited for dawn, and the family that grew from a broken promise into a strong household leaned into rest, while cottonwoods hummed what sounded like a